Hi, I'm Margaret, and I never expected my own son to look me in the eye and call me a loser. I was 67, living quietly in my small apartment, keeping to myself, trying to stay out of anyone's way. And suddenly, the person I raised, the person I had supported and nurtured, handed me papers that legally separated our finances. At that moment, I felt a cold weight settle into my chest, a mix of disbelief and hurt that I didn't quite know how to process. I remember staring at the table, at the stack of documents, my hands shaking ever so slightly, and feeling a strange calm take over me. It wasn't fear or anger yet, just the quiet awareness that something fundamental in our relationship had shifted, and I was powerless to stop it. I thought about how carefully he had measured me, how meticulously he and his wife, Patricia, had calculated my future, as if I were some problem to be solved, some burden to be managed. And yet, in that same moment, I also realized they didn't know everything. They didn't know what I had inherited. They didn't know the fortune that was about to change everything. As I signed the papers, I kept my mind steady, my heart guarded. The irony of it all was almost delicious. The one dismissed as helpless and powerless, about to gain control over a life that had treated me as an obligation rather than family. And as I placed the last signature, I couldn't help but wonder what would happen when they discovered just how wrong their calculations had been. I've always believed in facing challenges head-on, but this was different. It was personal, intimate, and yet it was the beginning of a journey that would not only transform my own life, but also teach them lessons about respect, loyalty, and character in ways they would never forget. And as I sit here reflecting on that day, I ask myself, and maybe you too, how often do we underestimate the quiet, the overlooked, the seemingly powerless? How often do we fail to see the strength that can rise when someone has been dismissed for far too long? I want to take you back, to show you how it all began, and how one unexpected inheritance, combined with years of overlooked wisdom and patience, set the stage for the kind of life lesson that can only be learned when expectations are turned completely upside down. This is where my story begins. Before all of this happened, my days were quiet, predictable, and modest. I worked part-time at the local library, shelving returned books, helping patrons find what they needed, and enjoying the calm rhythm that came with a life of routine. After my husband passed, the job gave me something to do, a reason to leave my small apartment each day, and a sense of purpose that helped keep loneliness at bay. I had spent decades taking care of my family, raising my son David, and quietly supporting him in every way I could. I remembered nights spent helping with homework, preparing meals, and offering advice when he needed it. I had hoped that, in return, they would see me as more than just a caretaker or a financial convenience. But over the years, I had begun to notice subtle shifts. Invitations to family events became fewer and more formal. My opinions seemed less important. My presence sometimes felt like a shadow, tolerated rather than welcomed. Living on Social Security and my modest savings, I had grown used to stretching every dollar. I had become skilled at living simply, finding joy in small pleasures: a cup of tea in the afternoon, a well-worn book, a short walk through my neighborhood. And yet, despite these small comforts, I sometimes felt invisible within my own family. I knew my son and his wife were doing well. David had a solid career, and Patricia was ambitious and confident. But their achievements often left me feeling quietly overshadowed. Evenings at home were filled with reflections. I remembered the subtle condescension when they spoke about money, their planning, Their assumptions that I would always be financially vulnerable, that I would quietly fade into the background if I ever ran out of resources. And I had allowed it to pass unnoticed, focusing instead on the small victories of everyday life, the moments when I felt truly present. Looking back now, I can see the pattern clearly: their careful calculations, their detachment, the way they measured my worth as though it could be quantified in dollars and cents. I tried to stay detached, to maintain my dignity, but deep down, there was a quiet sting. I had given my life to raise a family, and yet they had already started to see me as someone to manage, not someone to cherish. And then, just as the world felt like it was quietly closing in around me, an unexpected event shifted everything. Something that would turn years of careful underestimation on its head. Something that would show me that even when people dismiss you, even when they think you are powerless, life has a way of giving you a second chance, a chance to reclaim your dignity, your voice, and even your power. This is when I received the letter from Switzerland, from the law firm that represented my great-aunt Beatrice. The numbers in that letter made me sit down hard. 900 million. I read it multiple times, not quite believing that the modest woman I had met once at a family reunion had left me her entire fortune. The moment was surreal, almost dreamlike, and yet, amid the shock, I felt a curious calm, a quiet certainty that my life was about to change in ways I could never have imagined. Little did my son and Patricia know. Their careful planning had prepared them for nothing. And in the calm of that quiet evening, I began to think about what I could do next. What I would do next. The morning after I received that incredible letter from Switzerland, I felt a strange mix of disbelief and quiet determination. I thought about how my son, David, and Patricia had meticulously calculated my finances, imagining the exact moment I would struggle, the exact numbers that would define my failure. They had believed they were being practical, rational, responsible, and yet they had no idea that my life had just shifted in ways they couldn't even begin to imagine. I remember the heaviness of the phone call when David had reached out the next morning. He sounded concerned, almost rehearsed, urging me to consider downsizing, to move somewhere smaller, cheaper, more manageable. He spoke as though he were guiding a child, explaining the mathematics of my age, my income, and my expenses. I listened quietly, feeling a sting in my chest. But underneath, a spark of clarity began to grow. They were preparing for my poverty. But what they didn't know was that I had inherited a fortune that could turn the tables entirely. In the quiet of my apartment, I sat with a cup of tea, the letter folded neatly on the kitchen table. I thought about my great-aunt Beatrice, a woman I had met only once decades ago, who had left me her entire estate and the extraordinary trust she had placed in me. The numbers were staggering: properties in Geneva, London, New York, and Monaco. A cash reserve that alone could change my life beyond imagination. It wasn't excitement that I felt at first. It was calm. It was focus. I realized that for years, I had been underestimated, dismissed, treated as a liability. And now, for the first time, I had the means to reshape the reality around me. I could reclaim my dignity, assert control, and teach a lesson that would be impossible to ignore. The next hours were spent quietly researching, making calls, and planning. I needed to understand exactly what David and Patricia were managing, what assumptions they were making about my future. I wanted to see the world as they saw it, how they thought they could predict my decline, my dependence, my helplessness. and I saw it clearly. They had never considered that I might rise, that I might take action, that I might not be the person they assumed I was. I began imagining how to use this inheritance wisely, how to secure my future, and perhaps, in subtle ways, remind them of what they had taken for granted. It wasn't about revenge, at least not in the way people imagine it. It was about education, about showing them the consequences of their assumptions, about demonstrating that respect and love cannot be conditional on money or convenience. That day, as the sunlight filtered through my small apartment window, I realized that the power dynamic had already begun to shift. I could feel it in the quiet determination settling into my chest. A new awareness of possibility. The life that David and Patricia thought they had predicted for me was no longer mine to inhabit in their terms. And in that calm, reflective moment, I started to envision the first steps of a plan that would gradually, carefully, and irrevocably place control back into my hands. They had no idea what was coming, and that gave me clarity, focus, and, surprisingly, peace. It was in that moment I understood something essential sometimes. The quietest, most overlooked person holds the key to transformation. And as I set the letter aside and sipped my tea, I knew that the next days would be about turning potential into action and watching as the world around me slowly adjusted to a truth they had never anticipated. Once the reality of my inheritance fully settled in, I spent days quietly planning, imagining how to use the resources at my disposal. I knew that David and Patricia had been calculating my decline, expecting me to need help, to become a financial burden. But now, with this fortune, I realized I had the power to not just secure my life, but to subtly take control of theirs and to teach lessons they would never forget. I started by mapping out their worlds. David had worked for a mid-sized insurance company for years, comfortable but not unassailable. Patricia's interior design business was stable but fragile, dependent on a small client base and a rented office downtown. I wanted to understand their assumptions, their strengths, their vulnerabilities. I spent hours researching, carefully reviewing company records, public filings, and property ownership. Every detail, every number, was a thread I could follow. There was no rush, no dramatics. I methodically called my attorney, Jonathan Walsh, and began discussing the legal avenues I could pursue: shell companies, trusts, anonymous acquisitions. The idea wasn't to harm them directly. It was to create consequences that would reflect the way they had treated me. They had believed they were acting pragmatically, and now I would act in kind, with precision and patience. In the evenings, I would sit at my kitchen table, sipping tea, notebook open, laying out potential scenarios. Buying David's company seemed audacious at first, but as I ran the numbers, it became perfectly feasible. Acquiring Patricia's office building and eventually the local community bank would allow me to control multiple aspects of their financial lives without their knowledge. Every step I planned would remain discreet, strategic, and proportional. I reflected on my emotions as I made these plans. There was satisfaction in seeing a path unfold. Yes, but also a deep sense of calm. I wasn't seeking revenge in the way a storybook villain might. I was seeking justice, education, and the quiet power of making them see the consequences of underestimating someone they thought powerless. I wanted them to feel the same vulnerability I had once felt, but through a lens that revealed their own choices and judgments. There were moments when I paused, considering the moral weight of what I was doing. Could I truly justify taking control over their lives, even indirectly? And then I remembered the years of dismissal, the papers that severed our finances, the cold practicality that treated me as a liability. My focus sharpened. This wasn't cruelty. It was a lesson, delivered with clarity and intention. Each morning, I woke with renewed determination. By 2:30 p.m., I would have reviewed client lists, property documents, and financial statements. By late afternoon, I would call Jonathan, updating him on each step, refining offers, and ensuring everything remained legal, airtight, and invisible to them. I relished the thought of the subtle irony that the same people who had calculated my poverty down to the last dollar had no inkling that I was quietly positioning myself to change everything. The planning also required patience. I knew that for the lesson to resonate, the timing needed to be perfect. Every acquisition, every shift in control, had to happen in sequence. Their reactions would be most telling if they occurred naturally, without the hint of interference. Watching the world unfold according to their assumptions and then gently adjusting the pieces became an exercise in quiet empowerment. And all the while, I reminded myself why I was doing this. It wasn't for gloating. It wasn't for anger. It was to reclaim my dignity, to illustrate the consequences of dismissing someone's value, and to ensure that respect and empathy were not conditional on convenience or money. It was about turning knowledge and opportunity into action, about proving to myself and to them that the underestimated person often holds the most power. By the time I finished mapping out the steps, the plan was clear. Each move had a purpose, each acquisition a lesson, and each quiet victory a message that could not be ignored. And as I closed my notebook and looked out the window at the town I had called home for decades, I felt an unexpected calm, a readiness to move forward and watch the story unfold exactly as it was meant to. Once my plans were fully mapped out, the first moves began to take shape. Quietly, deliberately, I started the process of acquiring David's company. It was strange to feel this power, a sense of control that I had never imagined having over someone I had nurtured and raised. I reminded myself that this wasn't about hurting him personally, but about illustrating the consequences of dismissing someone, about showing that respect cannot be conditional. Patricia's office building was next. I made an offer that was perfectly reasonable, even generous, but it was enough to shift the balance of their financial landscape. Watching the dominoes fall, I felt a mix of satisfaction and reflection. I remembered the moments when they had calculated my decline down to the dollar, expecting that I would fail, expecting that I would need their help. Now, in quiet, measured steps, I was taking back the agency they had assumed I would never possess. I thought about the first day David would notice a shift. His confidence, which had always been so assured, would falter when he realized the world he thought he controlled had subtly changed. I imagined his surprise, the brief confusion, and the dawning understanding that his assumptions about me were wrong. This was the subtle power of my actions, the ability to teach lessons without confrontation, to let the consequences reveal themselves naturally. There were moments when I had to pause, to reflect on the ethical weight of what I was doing. I reminded myself that I was acting out of justice, not vengeance. I was creating circumstances that mirrored the way they had treated me, allowing them to experience the vulnerability I had endured. But in a controlled, fair way. It was a reminder to myself that power must be exercised thoughtfully, and lessons must be delivered with care. As each acquisition closed, as each decision quietly shifted their financial reality, I watched and waited. The subtleties were most satisfying, the small moments of confusion, the hints of worry. The realization that the safety net they had assumed existed was no longer theirs. I took care to keep my actions measured, legal, and purposeful. I wanted them to see the reflection of their own choices, to recognize the consequences without fear of harm beyond what was fair. I also began observing my own reactions. There was satisfaction, yes, but not the gloating that I had once imagined might accompany this. Instead, there was a calm clarity, a sense that I was finally asserting my value in a world that had often overlooked it. I felt gratitude for the opportunity to act thoughtfully, for the ability to shape outcomes with intelligence and care. By the end of these days, the shifts were evident. David's company was now under my direction, Patricia's building under my ownership, and their perception of my powerlessness had begun to crumble. They were beginning to understand that the assumptions they had made about me, about my limitations, were completely misguided. And in that quiet reflection, I understood something essential. Empowerment doesn't need to shout. It can be quiet, precise, and reflective, revealing truths in ways that are impossible to ignore. I had begun this process not to punish, but to illuminate, to help them see, at last, the value and strength of the person they had once dismissed. As I prepared for the next steps, I knew the coming days would reveal even more, and I allowed myself a moment to feel calm, ready, and quietly confident that the lessons I intended to teach would unfold exactly as they were meant to. As the final pieces of my plan fell into place, I prepared for the moment of truth. I reflected on how David and Patricia had treated me, measuring my life as if it were a spreadsheet, calculating every possible way I could fail. They had seen me as powerless, invisible, a burden waiting to happen. And now, with everything quietly under my control, I could show them the weight of their assumptions without ever raising my voice. The day I revealed the truth, I watched their faces as they realized what had changed. The confusion, the disbelief, and then the dawning understanding. It was palpable. David saw for the first time that his mother was no longer the person he had assumed he could predict, and Patricia felt the consequences of the choices she had made, the same choices she had justified as practicality. I shared with them the reality of my inheritance, not as a boast, but as a reflection of what had been possible all along. The fortune from Great-Aunt Beatrice was more than money. It was a lesson, a test of character that they had failed. Every small slight, every assumption that I would be a burden, had been observed, noted, and mirrored back in ways they could not ignore. I reminded them that this was never about revenge. It was about understanding, about teaching the importance of respect, loyalty, and empathy. Wealth had allowed me to act, yes, but the real lesson was about seeing people for who they truly are, beyond the convenience of circumstance or the security of expectations. I thought about the grandchildren, innocent in all of this, and ensured that they were cared for, with trust funds and opportunities secured. They were not part of the lesson, and their futures remained protected. It was a reminder to myself that even when using power wisely, compassion must always be part of the equation. Watching David and Patricia absorb the consequences, I felt a calm satisfaction. Not triumph, not joy in their misfortune, but a profound sense that truth had been revealed, and justice, in its quietest form, had been served. They had learned what it meant to misjudge someone, to treat love and family as conditional, and to assume weakness where there was strength. As I reflected on the journey from being dismissed as powerless to quietly reclaiming my agency, to finally standing in a place of dignity and control, I realized that the real victory was internal. The confidence, the clarity, the peace that came from knowing my worth could not be measured by anyone else, not even by those I loved most. And now, as I sit here sharing this story, I hope it reminds you that being underestimated does not define your potential. Sometimes the quietest, most overlooked people hold the keys to change their own lives and teach others a lesson about respect and empathy along the way. If this story resonates with you, I invite you to share it, leave a comment, or reflect on the people in your life who may be underestimated. Sometimes, understanding and compassion can create lessons far more powerful than anything else.